Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Stephen Sen. I'm the moderator for session 2. The less I speak, the more you get to hear what you want to hear. And our first speaker is going to be Daniël Lakens, who is from the Eindhoven University of Technology. Daniel, over to you.
All right, thanks so much. I'll share my slides. You should be able to see them now.
Yes, we can see them.
All
or
right.
I can anyway.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for a really interesting day yesterday. I greatly enjoyed myself. It was very nice to hear all these talks. I hope I can contribute something of interest to people as well. So we're talking about statistics wars and moving beyond these statistics wars. I looked a little bit into the causes of why people go to war, whether they're economic gain, territorial gain, religious wars, or nationalism. And if we want to pin down one reason why we're having statistics wars, I guess it's probably religion, or at least what in science comes closest to religion, which is your philosophy of science. So your decision of what you think the goal of statistical inferences should be. And we have to have a discussion about this if we want to maybe move forward a little bit about what we should be doing or shouldn't be doing. Yesterday we had discussions about this as well, whether we abandon certain approaches to statistics or not. So we have to talk a bit about what the goal of statistical inferences is, and there's something to choose, of course, otherwise we wouldn't be discussing this so much. So here is a criticism on the use of dichotomous decisions and p-values overall by psychologists. My own background is in psychology, so maybe some of the references will come from this area more than others. And Rosnow and Rosenthal have this famous quote that's on the bottom here. Surely God loves the 0.06 nearly as much as the 0.05. Can there be any doubt that God views the strength of evidence for or against the null as a fairly continuous function of the magnitude of P? Which might be true. I don't know what non-existing entities use as an approach to statistical inferences, but there are also other approaches to this or other viewpoints. And here we have Neyman and Pearson saying, look, it's not really about tests providing valuable evidence of the truth or falsehood of a hypothesis, but we may look at the purpose of tests from another viewpoint. Without hoping to know whether each separate hypothesis is true or false, we may search for rules to govern our behavior with regard to them, in the following which we ensure that in the long run of an experience we shall not be too often wrong. So this is a different goal. And again, some people in psychology say this can be kind of useful. This is Frick talking about how what we might want to do as scientists is establish a corpus of findings. And you should really see this as a bag of things where we put some things in that we think, okay, this is stuff that we know by now. This is things we can, assume. We don't have to discuss them or study them anymore. We accept these things to be true reasonably, at least for the foreseeable future. So criticism to these claims that we think about science as updating continuous probabilities about all sorts of things. He writes that it's probably not possible for people to keep track of all probabilities, but also in any case, scientists do not assign probabilities to claims. Instead, scientists act like the goal of science is to collect a corpus of claims that are considered to be established. And again, it's up to you to pick whatever you want. There's no one way or another, but I think there are arguments to make that like is written here by Taper and Lillet, saying science needs mechanisms for the accumulation of sound conclusions. Doesn't seem too unlikely that this is at least one of the things we do. And then when we have these conclusions, we can say, okay, this manipulation works. Let's just treat it like it works from now on. We're going to apply this in our own research, or let's abandon this research line because really there's nothing here anymore. We've tried everything. It's game over. In this case, the authors don't particularly like this idea of updating our beliefs based on subjective ideas. This corpus of claims need to be established in a way that we all sort of agree on it, not based on our subjective preferences. So here they say, what I think is a very nice quote, we do not care what you believe. We barely care what we believe. What we are interested in is what you can show. So which kind of things can you demonstrate are true? Now, it's true, I guess, in my experience, or in my field at least, that researchers like to make claims. They do it all the time. They make them in titles. Some journals try to ban it, but it's often true that they say X has an effect on Y or something, in the title. Or if not there, then at least if you read their conclusions. It's quite rare to see somebody say, look, here's a descriptive statistic. I'm going to skip the conclusion section. I've said what I want to say. You take this data and you draw your own conclusions. It's pretty rare to see this. You can also think about the role that this plays. And now we're not really talking about something like an ontology or something, but maybe a social epistemology. So making these claims in science can have certain uses for the way that we are currently organizing the way we do science. Making a claim draws a lot of attention to your work, both by people who might like the claim, but also people who are annoyed enough so that they will try to falsify your claim. And that practice, that is one way in which we try to sort of correct things that enter in the literature. So if we accept that at least some people like to make claims about things, then we can also think about methods that we can apply so that we can generate claims with a certain probability of being accurate. Now, you might think that we can skip the whole data collection process. Let's make things easy for ourselves. And instead of collecting data and doing all sorts of different statistics, we will just use coin flip from now on. So coin flip as a methodological procedure is, of course, not very accurate. If we use coin flips to say whether theories are true or wrong, we will reach approximately a 50% claims that are correct, right? 50% of the time will be correct. Now, I know I'm from psychology, so it's just a matter of time for somebody to joke that, psychologists might not do much better than this. But in any case, what we do is we try to be a little bit correct more often than 50%. So we develop testing procedures that control error rates in the long run so that the claims that we make are a little bit more likely to be accurate than 50% of the time. So that's the business some people are in. And I have to say that this is also what I recognize from my own work in experimental psychology. This is mainly what we do there. We come up with different theories. They make predictions where we try to figure out where they make conflicting predictions, and then we test them against each other to see which of these has most going for it. So even though a lot of people criticize the use of things like p-values, it seems that this approach, this theory testing approach, in these cases, p-values have something going for it. I think Steven Sen yesterday nicely said that, they're probably the most limited thing you can do. If you have a little bit of more structure in your data, it would be nice to go beyond them. But in my field in psychology, often people don't really have much more structure than this, regrettably. So, it's a starting point to go on this journey of making claims. And of course, we don't really, have very stable knowledge after any of these claims, single claims. We shouldn't think about this. I mean, people misinterpret these p-values and think they're the truth, but they're not. We would write something, if we didn't have word limits maybe, we claim that there is an effect, while acknowledging that if scientists make claim using this methodological procedure, they can be misled at most alpha or beta % of the time, which we deem acceptable. This is how you designed your study in a way that you think these rates are acceptable. So let's, for the foreseeable future, until new data emerges that can prove us wrong, assume that our claim is correct. Doesn't sound very exciting, but this is sort of what you get out of this process of claim making. And yeah, some people say this is pretty okay. I mean, pretty okay approach to drawing inferences. We don't say anything about the truth of things, but if we are a bit flexible in how we interpret what it means to decide to make some sort of statement. And we don't interpret the word decision too narrowly. For example, it can also include things about our beliefs about, well, no, beliefs maybe not, but we'll see in the next slide, our attitudes we take towards certain things. So this is Neyman saying, I hope to show that the processes, well, he talks about the statistical inference processes. He distinguishes three. The first is visualization of several possible sets of hypotheses relevant to the phenomenon. Second, deduction of these from these sets of hypotheses. And then the last thing I think is important. It's this, an act of will or decision to take a particular action. All right, so that's often what people say. Neyman Pearson statistics is lovely for error control in factories when you have to make actions to stop the production line. But he also says perhaps to assume a particular attitude towards the various sets of hypotheses, which could be, let's just assume for now that this is what we'll use in our studies. So when we accept or reject hypotheses in this framework, when we make these claims based on data, we don't really communicate any belief or any conclusions about the substantive hypothesis. It's more like, okay, we have this thing, let's use it now for a while. These claims are therefore not claims about the truth, but according to philosophies of science like Popper's a Popperian basic statement. So we have a pre-specified decision rule. And this is quite important, and people in my field starting to recognize a bit more that it's useful to pre-specify what would corroborate, but also what would falsify your prediction in advance. They try to do this in pre-registrations a bit more than they used to in the past. So we have these pre-specified decision rules and a set of background assumptions. And based on these, we basically make a statement that the data reflect a certain state of the world, right? And this statement corroborates our prediction when we test hypotheses or not. Now you might say, Daniel, you seem to like this stuff, making claims and controlling error rates a lot. I don't like it. That's fine. It's good. But logically, there are only two alternatives here. So either if you don't use this alternative, this methodological procedure that makes claims with no known error rates, then you have two other options. One is not to make claims. Very healthy thing to do. It's totally fine. You know, if your science can work like that, that's great. Or you make claims with unknown error rates. This is a little bit what Richard mentioned yesterday, where we have Bayes factors that, if they do not control error rates, can actually have quite high error rates if you still use them to make claims. A lot of Bayesians would probably say, don't use cutoffs to make Bayes factors, turn Bayes factors into claims. But a lot of people seem to do it in practice, again, because they like to make claims. So if we don't use these p-values in this way, like, you know, we don't have to use p-values, by the way. Yesterday we saw you can use Bayes factors to make claims as well. I don't really care whether in this sense you're a frequentist or a Bayesian. What I care about is whether you want to make claims or not. And if you want to make claims, yeah, then the goal is to build this collective corpus of findings, so to say, and to make sure that the information that's in there is correct or not wrong more often than we actually want. Now, if we do this and we have a procedure, and especially a procedure that doesn't rely too much on things like subjective priors, but things we can agree on, like error rates under certain assumptions, then that's a rather attractive property of a methodological approach to make claims, because we can now agree collectively on how severely certain claims have been made. If I do a study and I set my alpha at 0.000001, and I make sure that for all reasonable effect sizes we would be interested in, I have 99.99999% power. I think we'll all agree that the outcome of this test is, at least in terms of statistics, relatively severely tested, right? There's a high probability of not finding anything if I would be wrong, and a very high probability of finding something if I was right. So this is a way that we can design tests, or we can make claims where most people agree on the content of these claims. That would be sort of the goal here. But then I think that we can doubt a little bit about how this actually works in practice. And that's maybe a little bit of thoughts that I want to share that I've been thinking about in response to the fact that even when people start to rigorously pre-register their tests, and they try to do this as well as possible, then in essence, I think what we thought originally, I mean, maybe a decade ago when we started these things in psychology, I thought, okay, so we get people to write down in advance what they do, and then we have very good, severely tested claims. We will prevent them from messing around with all this flexibility in the data analysis. We might even recommend that they perform an a priori power analysis or have some sample size justification. And if we do this, then yeah, we have severely tested claims. It's nice. But in practice, it seems to become a little bit more difficult than this. It's not so simple that we just set these error rates and then everybody's happy about them. So this idea of, yeah, making claims with error rates that we all agree on is a little bit more complex in practice than I think we thought. So as people have started to pre-register, people often have to change these analyses that they pre-registered because it turns out they weren't so appropriate given the data they actually got, or maybe they have some new insights, they thought about it a little longer, and then they realized they need to change their analysis plan. Now, this is perfectly fine. You can, of course, do this, and you can transparently report that you've made some changes to your plans in advance. But now, the evaluation of the severity of a claim becomes a bit more troublesome, because we've given up the error control in a way to perform a test that has, I would say, higher validity, or at least that's the idea. So any deviations that you make are totally fine, and they can actually improve the case. So let's just say we have a well-intentioned scientist who really wants to do the best possible test of a prediction. They look at some data and they see that there's a problem they did not foresee, which happens. And they deviate from their analysis plan. Now, this is something that Mill would say is honest ad hocery, right? So you shouldn't make a mockery of this. I mean, if people are trying to do a good thing and improve their analysis, we should let them do this. There is a deviation. So we don't have this error control that we so much liked, right? We have seen some flexibility now in the data analysis, sometimes even based on data that has been observed. But the reason that people accept this deviation is not because the error control is fine. It's actually because they think the new analysis has higher validity, as we call it. It's a more valid analysis for the data. So this idea of validity is strongly related conceptually, I think, to the idea of severity, but it's not on a statistical level anymore. Right? They might sort of be the same thing in a more general focus, but in most of the literature, I would say that severity is mainly used more on the level of statistical claims. Not only, but mainly, I think, when we talk about it. But validity might be strongly related. And we thought about this with some co-authors. We're working on this with the people here on the slide. So these are some shared ideas on the next couple of slides. And together we took a look at some of these crises that have been happening in psychology. I don't know if you're completely aware about this, but it started out with a replication crisis. Turns out that things couldn't replicate as much as we hoped, more than Stephen Sen apparently thought it would be, but we were a bit generally, I would say, disappointed. And since then, people have been pointing out that that's just one thing that we weren't doing very well. In addition, we also didn't think carefully about our measurements. For example, we have ad hoc measures. Friday afternoon, we come with a couple of things. We'll ask our participants, and then Monday we run the data collection and we say, we have measured people's, well, whatever it is that we thought. There's a generalizability crisis that single studies, we have no idea whether they apply more broadly the conclusions. And also a theory crisis. So people make very limited bad theories. And even if you have any data, it doesn't matter. They often don't even have bearing on theoretical conclusions. So all of these, I think, are on a more broad level when we think about wanting to make claims related to maybe the same problems with severity, but it becomes even more difficult here to have an evaluation of the severity of these claims. So what we do in the paper is we talk about severity as a ratio of the probability of observing evidence given a hypothesis in the background knowledge relative to observing the evidence just because of the background knowledge. And this comes from Popper's work. So we have the idea that it should be extremely likely to find something if our hypothesis is true, but not just because we're studying something, not just because of the background knowledge, but only if our hypothesis is actually true. And if we're wrong, then we should not find anything. If our hypothesis is wrong, we should not find any corroborating evidence. So we colloquially summarize this as getting it right when you're right, getting it wrong when you're wrong. And we want both things to be true. So that means the probability of finding evidence if our hypothesis is correct, given certain background assumptions, should be high. And at the same time, we want the probability to just find any effect to be quite low. Because this allows us to make, well, severely tested claims, basically. So you can think of this in terms of statistics, for example. When you just find significant results, even if your hypothesis is wrong, then you basically have a very high type 1 error rate. Or if you have a high probability of finding something if your hypothesis is correct, and only then you would have high statistical power. And you want both of these things, like low error rates for the type 1 and type 2 error rate. So a lot of the focus on fixing issues has been in statistics. And here, I think in Deborah Mayo's book, there's an excellent description of how all these properties come together and threaten the severity of claims we make. So really flexibility in the data analysis means our type 1 error rate was crazy high, low statistical power. I'm not completely sure if they meet up at 50%, but maybe for some studies, we only had 50% power and we were messing around the data collection so much we had a 50% alpha level, and then we are really flipping a coin, basically. And also issues around publication bias, so that we actually don't see a track record of severely tested things. We only see part of the literature. Now, the severity of these statistical tests is a little bit easier to quantify because we have error rates. We can just, based on some assumptions, compute them. But even here, we already see some stress on the ease with which we can evaluate severity of tests, I would say. For example, now that people are pre-registering and deviating from pre-registrations, we have one researcher who might pre-register a student's t-test. So under the assumption that there's homogeneity of variances. But the other researcher thinks this is a crazy assumption to have in a specific data set, and thinks that the assumption is violated and would like to see another test. Now, in these cases, the error rates, of course, differ depending on the assumptions that you have about these data sets. So the same researcher can think that a test has been more severely tested, or a claim has been more severely tested than the other researcher, depending on whether they agree on the underlying assumptions of the statistical test. And it's also a bit of a question what we should do, because if somebody just naively pre-registered a student's t-test, and they actually see that their data is not, the homogeneity assumption is not met, what are they supposed to do? Deviate from this plan and give up some error control? Because are they doing this opportunistically or not? So here we already see there's a bit more loose space, basically, in making judgments about the severity of a test in statistics. It's already possible to have a bit more flexibility there, I would say. But the severity of statistical tests is not the only thing that matters when we want to make claims, right? Statistics is actually a small part of making claims in most research. There are measurements that need to be valid. There needs to be a solid theory that actually allows the derivation of certain predictions. So there are some other aspects that maybe relate to these crises that are mentioned, where we also want to think about the evaluation of severity of tests. And now, one example is what's now called the theory crisis. I mean, you can almost joke that if you want your paper to be noticed, you just say that there is some sort of crisis about it nowadays. I don't know if it still works, but it worked in the last couple of years. And here, a lot of people have criticized that in fields like psychology, where I'm from, people lack a clear specification of a theory's universality and precision. And we want both of these things to have a claim that can be severely tested. You need to specify what your theory is supposed to generalize to. If you're vague about the universality, you can, in a very ad hoc manner, say, well, of course, you tried to find the effect over there, but I didn't say you should also find it over there. I didn't specify that in advance. So you can opportunistically restrict the space with which your theory is supposed to make predictions. The same with precision. In this case, you can be overly precise or not precise enough, but you can make a prediction that is extremely precise and actually too precise, maybe because you think you can get away with a super precise prediction, in which case you're very likely to be wrong, even if your theory was pretty close, right, to a certain finding. Now, in these cases, I think what we are trying to say is that if your theory doesn't have certain properties, like well-specified universality and a certain amount of precision that is adequate for the test, then you can also get in a situation where it's very likely to get it wrong when you're right, or get it right, find corroboration for your test when you're actually wrong, right? So on this theory level, we have similar issues with severity, and they are related to the problems that we're discussing, I think, in making claims that we can trust. So, and this is actually similar in some ways as the type 1 error rate that we are talking about. So in statistics, the type 1 error rate reduces the probability of being wrong when you're wrong. Specificity reduces the possibility of a theory being proven wrong. So if you're not very specific about what you're actually predicting, it's very difficult to prove a theory wrong. And this has been mentioned many times before, of course, but if you frame it in terms of the possibility of having a severe test, I think it's useful to look at it from this perspective. Now, in these cases where your theory is not precise at all, it doesn't really matter whether you're performing direct replications or not, because they really have almost no bearing or consequence for the evaluation of the theory anyway, because it's so fake. And people have pointed this out for a long time, and it's true. The same problems emerge when you think about measurement or validity crisis. This is also a problem with the severity of claims, I would say. Here we call this validity, but I think conceptually, again, as I mentioned, they're very related. Now, there are a couple of examples you could provide here. Let me just give one where, for example, if we have a lack of measurement invariance, this increases the probability of finding a difference even if your hypothesis is wrong. So measurement invariance basically means that a measure works in exactly the same way across different situations. So for example, a measure that's used in the Netherlands, where I'm from, would work exactly the same in the UK. But if there's a lack of measurement variance and these measures don't work the same way in both countries, we can easily find differences, not because of our theory, but just because the measurement is not doing what it's supposed to do. So in this case, we have a similar problem where we make it too easy to corroborate a finding, even if our theory is actually wrong. Now, another example is measurement error, or things like a lack of construct validity. These reduce the severity of tests as they make it less likely to get it right when you're right. If measurement error is extremely large, you can actually be correct about your predictions, but you don't have high, power maybe, or a high ability to actually find these things. And construct validity is the same thing. If you're not very clear about what you're actually measuring, then you could find an effect, but it isn't because of what you actually meant to measure to begin with. So if we want severely tested claims, then researchers need to reach agreement not just on assumptions of tests so that their statistical error rates are controlled. That could be done, I guess, but also on assumptions about data generating mechanisms, the measurement of different concepts that they're interested in, and maybe to begin with their theories, right, to make sure what these theories predict. Now, this would require, if you want to do this, it's extremely difficult.
Daniel, you've taken 28 minutes so far.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I'm almost at the end. So if we want to be able to deal with all these issues and really have severely tested claims, then all the stuff we're doing on the side of the statistical inferences is lovely, but it's only a minor part, I would say, of the entire research cycle. It requires that we reach agreement on these assumptions, both on the level of measurement, on the level of theoretical predictions, what the theories actually predict or not, which auxiliary hypotheses basically are true or not, which we can build on. Now, these are also claims, but not on our theories ourselves, but on a lower level. These are typically, these auxiliary hypotheses are things that when we test theories, we need to know whether these are true or not. So to examine whether we can rely on these auxiliary hypotheses or not, we need an extremely systematic approach to test all of the underlying auxiliary hypotheses. There's a very nice paper by Eugen Tunk and Tunk about a systematic replication framework in which we could systematically test all these hypotheses. But if you read this paper, you see it is a ridiculous amount of work to do this well. So I guess the take-home message here is that if we want severely tested claims, it's not something we can easily do. It's a lot more work than we thought before. So just to summarize, I think for some scientists, we like to make claims. And this is actually one goal that they have when they collect data. Not for everybody, but for some scientists, this is what they want to do. And I think if we make claims, it is probably to each and everyone's benefit if we make sure that these claims have been severely tested. So they have a very low probability of being wrong when they're right, or basically getting it right when you're right and getting it wrong when you're wrong. Now, on the statistical level, we can get pretty close to quantifying the severity with which we have tested claims. So I think there we have done a lot of work. There are still some underlying assumptions here if you want to evaluate the severity of tests, and we won't agree on all of them, but we can examine them, and their impact is maybe a bit more modest. But claims in general depend on more than statistics. They also depend on all these other aspects that people have doubted, like measurement, theory. And I think there we can really make a lot of gain of also thinking about these issues from this severity perspective. So how in all of these domains can we increase the probability that we make claims that are right when we're right, and claims that get it wrong when we're wrong, especially the second part, of course. Falsifying predictions is not very developed in many fields, maybe my field, but I think in many fields. And one way around this is to really develop a framework where we systematically and severely test these underlying auxiliary hypotheses that relate to measurement and theory as well, to increase the overall severity of claims that we make. That's it. Thanks.